The Honorable Robert H. Jackson, Attorney General of the United States, speaking under the auspices of the Democratic National Committee, will now address you on the topic, A World of Promises. Attorney General Jackson.
One of the amiable weaknesses of Americans is the short-term view of the nation's needs that we take during campaigns. We grow excited over pledges for quick results that are lightly given and soon forgotten. We become obsessed with detail. We are entertained with our happy pastime of exchanging personalities. All of this is accepted as a part of our democratic traditions and fortunately passes away in the Christmas spirit that always follows elections. But there is another way to look at this election. I ask you tonight to look at some of the long-term implications of this election for a free country which is surrounded by dictators. Dictators who play for vast stakes and who reckon their policy in terms of decades. The totalitarian states, whether communist, fascist, or Nazi, have based their programs on one major assumption: that capitalism as a way of doing business had become obsolete, and that democracy as a way of life was approaching the end of its days. It has been their belief that free countries, like our own, must disintegrate as a result of their own weaknesses and fail in their own confusion, while the dictators, with a singleness of aim and a unity of command, ride through in triumph. That has been the major point of their strategy. You will find it in all their writings from Karl Marx to Mein Kampf. In this country, they were almost right. There were seeds of danger planted here during the 1920s, when every kind of economic folly was encouraged, when every economic excess was smiled upon, and when no thought was given to the reckoning that ultimately had to be faced. Because of that folly and blindness, we suffered during the dark years of 1930, 31, and 32, and we came dangerously close to the brink of the revolutionary disaster that swept other countries. The totalitarian prophets were gleefully predicting the breakup of capitalism and the downfall of democracy. In other countries, their prophecies were realized. In those countries, there was confusion of policies. There were frequent changes of leadership. Cabinets rose and cabinets fell. Promises were made and forgotten. Humble people, made desperate by suffering, turned from moderate remedies to extreme ones. Ruthless men took advantage of their desperation to destroy their freedom. If things had proceeded in America according to the same pattern, the masses of our people would now be so dissatisfied with their government that they would be ready to abandon democracy. But something very different happened in America. We witness today the masses of the people so devotedly attached to their administration that they are demonstrating deep resentment at the attacks and sneers of a rival candidate. More than at any time in our memory, the masses of the people are determined today to preserve the kind of government which will let them choose for themselves such leadership as that of President Roosevelt's. In this country, to the amazement and chagrin of the totalitarian planners, there arose out of the despair and confusion of 1932 a new spirit, a positive and vigorous concept of democracy. President Roosevelt pointed out that the way to avoid fulfillment of the dictator's prophecy of failure was to provide democracy with a social program that would end unrest. He saw that the way to save capitalism was to bring about an economic program which would rid it of its abuses and strengthen it for survival. He saw that a system of free enterprise, under which men's savings were swept away in bank failures and in foreclosures upon farms and homes, was a capitalist system endangered by its own caprice, and that if it failed to take care of the aged or unemployed, it was endangered by its cruelty. America, under the program of Franklin D. Roosevelt, upset totalitarian calculations of world revolution. Dictators had hoped to see a bitter and disheartened working class in this country that would be unwilling to go to the shops to produce for democracy. They see instead the working people of America solidly behind the president and ready to sacrifice anything under his leadership. They had hoped to see a wave of social upheaval that would impair the institutions of free enterprise. Instead, they see the majority of American industry, although opposed to the president politically, generally recognizing that reform was necessary and cooperating for defense. One can well understand that the dictators would prefer a return to the confusion and contradictions that characterized the era before 1933. They would much prefer an administration which would ignore the realities of our times as the Republicans ignored them during the 1920s. Throughout the 1920s, the fair-weather Republican administrations closed their eyes to these realities. The facts were known. The fact that our illusory prosperity was based on inflation, the fact that technological unemployment was increasing, the fact that men over 45 were no longer being employed in industry, the fact that even then 1/3 of our nation was ill-clothed, ill-housed, and ill-fed. These facts were known to the Republican administrations of the 1920s. They were presented to Mr. Hoover by his own Committee on Social Trends. But the only part of America that the Republicans could see was the stock ticker. An example of their method of dealing with America's tragedy was to send armed troops to drive the bonus marchers out of Washington. No nation could long survive under that kind of rule. Nor have the Republicans contributed anything constructive during the past 7 years. During the entire years of the New Deal, they have contributed nothing but negative opposition. The Republican record in Congress has been against every New Deal measure for social progress and economic strengthening, and it is well known that it was the Republicans who opposed every effort of the New Deal during the last 7 years to improve the defenses of this country. I do not glory in the failure of the Republicans to develop a program of their own. I think it has been the nation's loss that they have had nothing constructive to suggest. But the fact is that in the midst of world upheaval, it has been Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal who have given America a positive program of social strengthening. The fact is that the New Deal alone offers America such a program today. Against the threat of the revolutionary totalitarian idea, Republicans have nothing to offer America. You do not have to look any further than the Republican candidate's campaign to prove that he has nothing to offer. He was hailed at Philadelphia as the indispensable man for the Republican Party. So indispensable that all real Republicans had to be cast aside to make way for him. But he has failed to develop any affirmative policy or any positive leadership. He began by demanding that the president debate with him, but he's shown that there was no need for that. He debates with himself, taking both sides of every issue. For example, in Indiana, he asked for a Republican Congress, which would repeal what he called pernicious legislation. At other times, he has assured his audiences that he is for the social program of the New Deal. At Yonkers, he declared that relief checks must stop, and in the same speech, he pledged himself to continue relief and the farm program. He has sneered at the New Deal as candy stick government and promised to end it. Yet one by one, he has endorsed every single measure of the New Deal. In foreign policy, he is equally confused. One day, he scolds Mr. Roosevelt for his forthright statement about the aggressors. And the next day, and sometimes in the same speech, he himself out-Roosevelt's Roosevelt in denouncing them. He demands aid for Britain, but when it is given, he denounces it as arbitrary and dictatorial. So frequent and numerous have been his contradictions and misstatements that the Louisville Courier-Journal has summed up his campaign as a model of disorganization and crossed purposes. His administration, were he to have been elected, would be a model of Republican confusion which would delight the enemies of democracy. Nobody will deny that the New Deal has made mistakes, but it cannot be denied that through these dangerous times, which in Europe have produced dictators, the President's leadership has held this country to ways of orderly living and free institutions. No dictator in Europe dares to call or hold a free election. You are in a campaign to elect a president. You know that there will be no soldiers at the polls to tell you how to vote. You know that the opposition to the president has the most unbridled freedom of speech and of the press, and that anyone in this country can criticize the president or sneer at his fine command of English or assail him personally without the slightest interference from governmental authority. The president's opponent may provoke his audiences into demonstrations of hostility, but he has no suppression from anyone in authority. You know that there are in the air boastful predictions of the opposition that a great blitzkrieg of publicity for Wilkie, in magazines and newspapers, on billboards and over the radio, by pamphlet and by speech-making, is about to descend on this country like a bombing squadron on London. For 7 years, the same kind of propaganda has been falsely accusing the New Deal of dictatorial aims. But you yourselves know that during all of that time, there is not a single freedom which you as a citizen have lost. 7 years of experience with the Republican opposition have shown that the Republican Party has nothing to offer America. 3 months' experience in this campaign with candidate Wilkie has shown that he has nothing to offer America. On the contrary, the American people know that Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership offers America the greatness and the triumph of a working democracy on this continent.
Speaking under the auspices of the Democratic National Committee, the Attorney General of the United States, the Honorable Robert H. Jackson, has addressed you on the topic, A World of Promises. Copies of this talk are available. Listeners desiring copies should address their requests to the Democratic National Committee, Radio Division, Hotel Biltmore, New York City.